At my son's wedding, my daughter-in-law shouted into the microphone, "The old cheapskate isn't paying anything. Leave a check for $80,000. Everyone laughed at me. I left in silence and made a call. 15 minutes later, the waiter played a video on the big screen. She fainted on the spot. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I should have known it was coming. The signs were all there. The way Susan rolled her eyes whenever I spoke, how she'd whisper to my son Michael during family dinners, the subtle comments about my simple lifestyle. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at their wedding reception. The Riverside Country Club was decorated beautifully, I'll give Susan that. White roses everywhere, crystal chandeliers casting a warm glow over the 150 guests. I sat at table 7, not with the immediate family as I'd expected, but squeezed between Michael's college roommate and some distant cousins I barely knew. Susan had made the seating arrangements, of course. I wore my best dress, navy blue with small pearls, the one I'd bought for my late husband's funeral 3 years ago. It wasn't designer like the other mothers of the groom I'd seen, but it was clean and appropriate. Or so I thought. The first few hours went smoothly enough. I smiled for photos, made small talk with strangers, and watched my only child dance with his new wife. Michael looked so happy, his face glowing with that newlywed bliss. I remembered feeling that way once, 35 years ago, when his father and I were just starting out. The trouble began during the toasts. Susan's father spoke first, going on about their family's traditions and values. Then Michael's best man told embarrassing stories from college. Finally, it was time for the parents to speak. Susan's mother went first, delivering a polished speech about love and commitment that felt rehearsed, but appropriate. Then the microphone was passed to me. I stood up slowly, my hands trembling slightly as I held the microphone. The room fell quiet, all eyes on me. I'd practiced my speech for weeks, keeping it simple and heartfelt. "I want to thank everyone for being here to celebrate Michael and Susan," I began, my voice steady despite my nerves. "Michael has always been the light of my life, and seeing him so happy makes my heart full. Susan, welcome to our family. I know you'll take good care of each other." I was about to continue when Susan suddenly stood up at the head table. Her face was flushed, whether from champagne or anger I couldn't tell. "Wait, hold on," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room. She reached for the microphone, and I handed it to her, thinking she wanted to add something sweet. Instead, she turned to face the entire reception, her voice amplifying through the speakers. "Before we finish with all these touching speeches, I think we should address the elephant in the room," Susan announced, her words slightly slurred. "Michael's mother here talks about family, but where's her contribution to this wedding? We spent $43,000 on this reception alone, and the old cheapskate hasn't paid for anything, not even a proper engagement gift." My stomach dropped. The room went completely silent except for the soft jazz music still playing in the background. "Susan," Michael started to say, but she waved him off. "No, Michael. Someone needs to say it. She shows up in her discount dress, eats our expensive food, drinks our premium bar, and what does she contribute? A $20 picture frame from Target, and some excuse about being on a fixed income." Susan laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. The least she could do is write a check. Maybe $80,000? Actually help pay for the wedding she's enjoying so much? The silence that followed was deafening. Then slowly, people began to chuckle. Quiet at first, then louder. Susan's friends at the head table were practically cackling. Even some of my own relatives were smiling behind their napkins. I felt my face burn with humiliation. $80,000. The number hung in the air like an accusation. To most people in this room, it probably seemed like pocket change. To them, I was just the poor mother-in-law who couldn't keep up with their lifestyle. "Susan, that's enough," Michael finally said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked embarrassed, but not angry. Not defensive of his mother, just uncomfortable that his wife had aired their private conversations in public. I set my napkin down carefully and stood up. Every eye in the room was on me, waiting to see how the poor old woman would react to being called out so publicly. Some faces showed pity, others amusement. a few genuine shock at Susan's cruelty. But I didn't defend myself. I didn't make excuses about my modest teacher's pension or explain that I'd been saving every penny for months just to afford the mother of the groom dress and the hotel room for the weekend. Instead, I simply said, "Excuse me," and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I could hear Susan continue talking, probably making jokes about my dramatic exit. The laughter followed me across the marble floor of the country club lobby. By the time I reached the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely find my car keys. I sat in my old Honda Civic for several minutes, listening to the muffled sounds of the party continuing without me. Through the windows, I could see the warm lights of the reception, the silhouettes of people dancing and celebrating. My son's wedding, and I was sitting alone in a parking lot because his wife had decided to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. The worst part wasn't even the money comment. It was the laughter. The way people I'd known for years had joined in, as if my inability to throw money around made me less worthy of respect. But as I sat there in the darkness, feeling smaller than I had in decades, I remembered something Susan didn't know, something nobody in that room knew. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. The call connected on the second ring. "Robert, it's Janice. I think it's time." "Are you certain about this, Janice?" Robert's voice came through the phone, professional but concerned. He'd been my attorney for 15 years, handling my husband's estate and helping me navigate the legal maze after David's death. But this call was different. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Through the car window, I could see guests coming and going from the country club entrance, probably stepping outside for cigarettes or fresh air. None of them looked in my direction. Why would they? I was just the forgotten mother-in-law sitting alone in the parking lot. "All right then, I'll have the documentation ready within the hour. Are you sure you want it displayed this way? It's rather dramatic." I almost laughed. Dramatic. After what Susan had just done to me in front of 150 people, dramatic seemed like exactly what the situation called for. "Yes, Robert, exactly as we discussed, the full disclosure." I hung up and leaned back against the headrest, closing my eyes. The events of the past 6 months played through my mind like a movie I'd watched too many times. It started with Aunt Eleanor's funeral. She'd been my father's sister, a spinster who'd never married and had no children of her own. Eleanor had always been the black sheep of our family, too independent, too outspoken, too unwilling to conform to what women of her generation were supposed to be. She'd worked as a traveling nurse, then later as a real estate investor, buying up properties in what were then considered bad neighborhoods. Everyone thought she was eccentric at best, foolish at worst. When she died at 91, I was surprised to be named as her sole heir. We'd exchanged Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, but I hadn't seen her in person for almost 5 years. The reading of her will was a shock that still made my head spin. $2.7 million. All those worthless properties she'd bought in the 1970s and 80s, they were now in the heart of gentrified neighborhoods. Her modest investments had grown into a substantial portfolio. And she'd left it all to me, with one condition. I was to keep the inheritance secret for at least 6 months and observe how my family treated me during that time. Eleanor always was a good judge of character, Robert had said after reading the unusual provision. She wanted to make sure her money went to someone who would use it wisely, not just someone who would spend it freely. At first, I thought the condition was strange, even hurtful. But as the months passed, I began to understand Eleanor's wisdom. Michael started visiting less frequently after the engagement was announced. When he did come by my small apartment, he seemed distracted, always checking his phone or talking about wedding expenses. Susan rarely came with him, claiming she was too busy with wedding planning. The few times I did see Susan, she made subtle comments about my lifestyle. "Oh, Janice, you really should consider moving to a nicer neighborhood." Or, "Don't you get tired of cooking for yourself every night? There are lovely senior communities with meal services." The comments stung because I knew what she was really saying. I was an embarrassment. My modest apartment with its second-hand furniture and coupon-organized kitchen drawer didn't fit the image she wanted for her new family. But I said nothing. I watched and listened, just as Eleanor's will required. The worst moment came 3 weeks before the wedding. Michael had stopped by to drop off my invitation, and Susan was with him. She looked around my living room with barely concealed disdain. "You know, Janice," she said, settling onto my couch like she was afraid it might stain her designer dress. "Michael and I have been talking. After we get back from our honeymoon, we think you should seriously consider selling this place and moving into one of those nice assisted living facilities. Nothing fancy, just somewhere more appropriate for your situation. My situation. Code for poor and therefore inconvenient." Michael had nodded along, not meeting my eyes. "It would give us peace of mind, Mom, knowing you're somewhere safe, with people to check on you. Safe. As if my ability to take care of myself was somehow in question just because I lived modestly. That night, I'd called Robert and asked him to prepare the documentation. If my own family was so concerned about my financial situation, perhaps it was time they learned the truth. Now, sitting in the country club parking lot with the taste of humiliation still bitter in my mouth, I was glad I'd made that call. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert. "Everything is ready. The video presentation will begin in approximately 10 minutes. The device has been given to the catering manager as requested." I took a deep breath and checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My makeup was smudged from the tears I'd shed earlier, but I could fix that. I pulled out my compact and carefully reapplied my lipstick. If I was going back into that reception, I wanted to look composed. The walk back to the country club entrance felt like the longest of my life. With each step, I thought about Susan's words, about the laughter that had followed me out of the room, about the pity in people's eyes. But I also thought about Eleanor, who'd spent her life being underestimated and had the last laugh. I thought about the documentation sitting in Robert's office, proof of assets that would shock everyone in that reception hall. Most of all, I thought about the lesson Eleanor had tried to teach me. People's true character reveals itself when they think you have nothing to offer them. Susan had just failed that test spectacularly. The country club doorman held the door open for me with a sympathetic smile. "Everything all right, ma'am?" "Perfect," I replied. And for the first time all evening, I meant it. Inside, the reception was in full swing. The band was playing, couples were dancing, and the bar was still busy. I noticed that Susan was back at the head table, laughing loudly with her friends, probably still reveling in her public takedown of the poor mother-in-law. I made my way back to table 7, sliding into my seat as quietly as possible. The people at my table glanced at me with mixtures of sympathy and curiosity, but no one said anything. On stage, the band finished their current song, and the lead singer stepped up to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been asked to pause the music for a special presentation. If everyone could please direct their attention to the screen behind us." A large projection screen descended from the ceiling, and the lights dimmed slightly. Susan looked confused, turning to Michael with a frown. My heart was pounding, but my hands were perfectly steady as I folded them in my lap and waited for the show to begin. The screen flickered to life, and suddenly the reception hall was filled with Susan's voice. But this wasn't Susan the blushing bride, or even Susan the vindictive daughter-in-law from moments ago. This was Susan in her most unguarded moments, captured by hidden cameras I never knew existed. The first clip showed Susan at what appeared to be a bridal salon, surrounded by her friends. She was trying on wedding dresses while her bridesmaids sat nearby with champagne glasses. "God, you should see his mother's apartment," Susan was saying, twirling in front of a 3-way mirror. "It's like stepping back into 1980. Polyester furniture, clip-on lamps, and this pathetic little kitchen with appliances older than Michael. I swear the woman shops exclusively at garage sales." Her friends giggled, and one of them asked, "What are you going to do about her?" Susan shrugged, adjusting the bodice of a gown that probably cost more than my monthly pension. "Michael thinks we should help her move into some senior home after the wedding. Honestly, it would be a mercy. The woman is clearly struggling, and it's embarrassing for our family image." I felt my chest tighten as I watched my future daughter-in-law discuss my life like I was a problem to be solved. Around me, the reception guests were shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The easy laughter from earlier had died completely. The video cut to another scene. Susan at what looked like a country club lunch with her mother and sister. They were sitting on an outdoor terrace, mimosas in hand, while Susan showed them something on her phone. "Look at this," Susan said, holding up her screen. "This is what she gave us for our engagement. A $20 picture frame from Target. I'm not even kidding." Her mother grimaced. "Oh dear. Well, perhaps she doesn't understand the expectations." "She understands perfectly," Susan replied, her voice sharp with irritation. "She's just cheap. Michael keeps making excuses about her being on a fixed income, but honestly, how fixed can it be? She worked as a teacher for 30 years. She should have some savings, some investments. Instead, she acts like every penny is precious." Susan's sister leaned forward conspiratorially. "Maybe she's hiding money. You know how these old people can be, paranoid about spending anything." "If she is, she's doing a damn good job of it," Susan laughed bitterly. "Her apartment looks like a thrift store exploded. And don't get me started on her wardrobe. I've seen the same 5 outfits rotating for months." The camera caught Susan's face in profile as she continued. "The worst part is how Michael defends her. He acts like her poverty is somehow noble, like she's making sacrifices for some greater good. It's pathetic." I could feel eyes turning toward me throughout the reception hall. Some guests looked shocked, others mortified. At the head table, Michael's face had gone pale, and he was staring at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. The video shifted again, this time showing Susan on the phone in what appeared to be her apartment. She was pacing back and forth, gesticulating wildly as she spoke. "I'm telling you, Mom, something has to be done about her," Susan was saying. "She's going to be a constant embarrassment. Can you imagine introducing her to the partners at Michael's firm? Oh, this is my mother-in-law. She shops at Walmart and drives a 15-year-old Honda." There was a pause as Susan listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. "No, I don't think she has any money stashed away. Trust me, I've looked. The woman probably has less than $5,000 to her name. Michael keeps talking about helping her, but I didn't marry him to become a charity case for his pathetic mother." The words hit me like physical blows. Pathetic. Charity case. Embarrassment. This was how my son's wife really saw me. Not as a person deserving of respect, but as a burden to be managed or hidden away. The final clip was the most devastating. It showed Susan and Michael in their shared apartment, apparently having an argument. Michael was sitting on their couch while Susan stood in front of him, her arms crossed. "Your mother is becoming a real problem," Susan was saying. "The wedding is in 3 weeks, and I'm already worried about how she's going to look next to my family. My parents spent $18,000 on their outfits alone, and she'll probably show up in some discount store dress." Michael's voice was quiet but defensive. "She's doing her best, Susan. She doesn't have the resources your parents do." "That's exactly my point," Susan snapped. "She doesn't have resources, which means she's going to be our responsibility forever. Do you want to be supporting your mother for the rest of your life? Because that's what's going to happen." "She's not asking for support," Michael protested weakly. Susan laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the now silent reception hall. "She doesn't have to ask. Look at her, Michael. She's 63 years old, living in a rundown apartment, driving a car that belongs in a junkyard. She's one emergency away from being completely destitute. And when that happens, guess who she's going to turn to?" The video showed Michael running his hands through his hair, looking exhausted. "What do you want me to do, Susan? Cut her out of my life?" "I want you to set boundaries," Susan replied firmly. "After we're married, we need to make it clear that we can't be her financial safety net. Maybe if she understands that, she'll make better decisions about her future." The screen went black, and the reception hall fell into complete silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. I sat perfectly still, watching as 300 people processed what they'd just witnessed. Susan's face had gone completely white, and she was gripping the edge of the head table so tightly her knuckles were visible even from my distant seat. Michael was staring at her with a mixture of shock and horror, as if he were seeing his wife clearly for the first time. "Susan, he said quietly, his voice carrying in the silence. What the hell was that? Susan's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. She looked around the room desperately, searching for some explanation, some way to undo what everyone had just seen and heard. Finally, she managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't. Those were private conversations. This is illegal. Someone recorded me without permission, but her protests fell flat. The damage was done. Everyone in that room now knew exactly what she thought of me, exactly how she'd planned to handle the problem of Michael's embarrassing mother. At table 7, the woman sitting next to me leaned over and whispered, "My God, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Similar murmurs were rising from tables throughout the hall. The mood had shifted completely. Instead of being the object of pity or ridicule, I'd become the victim of a cruel woman's calculated cruelty. Susan stood up abruptly, swaying slightly on her feet. For a moment, I thought she might try to explain herself, to somehow justify what everyone had just witnessed. Instead, her eyes rolled back and she collapsed, fainting dead away onto the pristine white tablecloth of the head table. Chaos erupted the moment Susan hit the table. Her bridesmaids screamed, glasses shattered, and the beautiful wedding cake toppled sideways, sending 3 tiers of vanilla sponge and buttercream cascading across the white linen. I watched from table 7 as Michael jumped up, reaching for his unconscious wife while simultaneously looking around the room with wild, desperate eyes. This wasn't how he'd imagined his wedding day ending. His bride passed out cold while the entire reception processed the ugly truth about who she really was. "Someone call 911!" Susan's mother shrieked, rushing toward the head table while trying to maintain some semblance of dignity in her $1,500 mother-of-the-bride dress. But the country club manager was already on it, speaking quietly into his radio while several staff members hurried over with ice water and smelling salts. This clearly wasn't the first time they'd dealt with a wedding crisis, though I doubted they'd ever seen anything quite like this. Susan's father stood frozen behind his chair, his face red with embarrassment and what looked like genuine anger. He kept glancing between his unconscious daughter and the now blank projection screen, as if trying to reconcile the poised young woman he'd raised with the cruel person everyone had just witnessed. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as guests tried to process what they'd seen. Some were pulling out their phones, probably texting friends and family who hadn't attended. Others were gathering their purses and wraps, clearly ready to make a hasty exit from what had become the most uncomfortable social situation of their lives. But I remained seated, watching it all unfold with a strange sense of calm. This wasn't how I'd planned to spend my son's wedding reception, but there was something deeply satisfying about watching Susan face the consequences of her own cruelty. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, Susan's eyelids fluttered open. She looked confused at first, blinking up at the circle of concerned faces hovering over her. Then awareness crept back in, and with it, the horrifying memory of what had just happened. "The video," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Who did this?" Michael helped her sit up, but his movements were mechanical, like he was going through the motions without really being present. "Susan, we need to talk about what I just saw. It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Susan said, her voice getting stronger but taking on a defensive edge. "Those were private conversations. Someone violated my privacy." "Your privacy?" Michael's voice was quiet, but I could hear the anger building underneath. "Susan, you called my mother pathetic. You said she was an embarrassment to our family." Susan struggled to her feet, aided by her bridesmaids, but she was clearly unsteady. Whether from the fainting episode or the alcohol she'd consumed earlier, I couldn't tell. "Michael, you have to understand," she began, reaching for his hands. He pulled away. "I was frustrated. Planning this wedding has been so stressful, and your mother. She just doesn't understand the kind of life we're trying to build." "The kind of life we're trying to build?" Michael repeated, his voice getting louder. "What kind of life requires humiliating my mother in public?" Around the room, conversations had mostly stopped as people strained to hear the drama unfolding at the head table. Some guests were openly staring now, no longer pretending to mind their own business. Susan looked around desperately, seeming to realize for the first time that her breakdown was being witnessed by everyone they knew. "Can we please discuss this privately?" "Like you discussed me privately?" I spoke for the first time since returning to the reception, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "In bridal shops and country clubs in your apartment?" Every head turned toward me. I stood up slowly, smoothing down my discount dress, the one Susan had mocked so cruelly just an hour earlier. "You wanted to know about my financial situation, Susan," I continued, walking toward the head table with measured steps. "You seemed very concerned about whether I could contribute to your expensive lifestyle." Susan's face went pale again. "Janice, I'm sorry. I was upset. I said things I didn't mean." "Oh, but you did mean them," I replied calmly. "That's what made those recordings so illuminating. They showed who you really are when you think no one important is listening." I reached into my small purse and pulled out a folded document. "Since you were so curious about my finances, I thought you might like to see my recent bank statements." Michael frowned. "Mom, you don't need to do this." "Actually, I think I do." I unfolded the papers and held them up so Susan could see the numbers clearly. "As of this morning, my checking account balance is $2.7 million. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear someone's stomach growling at a table across the room. Susan's mouth fell open, and she stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. That's impossible," she stammered. "You live in that tiny apartment. You drive that old car." "Because I choose to," I said simply. "Because I learned a long time ago that how you spend your money says a lot about who you are as a person. And because I wanted to see what kind of people my son had chosen to surround himself with." Michael looked stunned. "Mom, where did this money come from?" "Your great-aunt Eleanor left it to me when she died 6 months ago," I explained, keeping my eyes on Susan's horrified face. "But her will had an interesting condition. I had to keep the inheritance secret for 6 months and observe how my family treated me during that time." Understanding dawned in Michael's eyes, followed quickly by shame. She was testing us. She was giving me information, I corrected. Information about who really cared about me as a person and who just saw me as a burden or an embarrassment. Susan had gone from pale to green, and I wondered if she might faint again. "You've been rich this whole time?" she whispered. "While we were. While you were calling me pathetic and planning to ship me off to a nursing home," I finished. "Yes, Susan. I was rich this whole time, rich enough to have paid for this entire wedding without blinking, rich enough to buy you a house or a car or whatever material thing you thought I was too poor to provide." The implications were sinking in for everyone in the room. Not only had Susan revealed herself to be cruel and heartless, but she'd done it while insulting someone who could have made all her financial dreams come true. Susan's father stepped forward, his face grim. "Susan Marie, what have you done?" But Susan wasn't listening to her father. She was staring at me with a mixture of horror and calculation, and I could practically see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to figure out how to fix this disaster. "Janice," she said, forcing her voice to sound sweet and conciliatory, "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I never meant any of those things. I was just stressed about the wedding, and I said some things I shouldn't have." "Stop," Michael said quietly. But his voice cut through Susan's babbling like a knife. "Just stop talking." He turned to look at me, his face full of shame and regret. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have defended you. I should have shut this down the moment it started." "Yes," I said simply. "You should have." The weight of that agreement seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He sat down heavily in his chair, staring at his hands. Susan looked back and forth between us, panic setting in as she realized that her marriage might be over before the reception had even ended. The reception hall had become a theater, and everyone was waiting for the final act. I could feel the weight of 150 pairs of eyes on me as I stood there, still holding the bank statements that had just shattered Susan's world. "There's more," I said quietly, reaching back into my purse, since we're being honest about everything tonight. Susan's remaining color drained from her face. "More?" I pulled out another document, this one bearing the letterhead of Whitfield and Associates, one of the most prestigious law firms in the state. This is a copy of Aunt Eleanor's complete will, the part that explains exactly what she wanted me to do with her money. Michael looked up from his hands, curiosity overriding his shame for a moment. What do you mean? Eleanor was very specific about her intentions, I said, unfolding the legal document. She didn't just want to test how you treated me. She wanted to ensure that her money would be used to help family members who demonstrated genuine character and kindness. I cleared my throat and began to read directly from the will. Quote, "If my niece Janice observes that her family treats her with respect, love, and dignity during the 6-month observation period, she is to establish a family trust fund. This fund will provide for education expenses for future generations, emergency assistance for family members in genuine need, and support for family members who show kindness and consideration for others, regardless of their perceived financial status." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Susan had spent months plotting to distance herself from her poor mother-in-law, not knowing that treating me with basic decency could have secured her family's financial future for generations. However, I continued reading, if Janice observes cruelty, manipulation, or treatment based solely on perceived financial status, she is to donate the entire inheritance to charitable organizations, with the exception of funds set aside for family members who demonstrated genuine kindness during the observation period. Susan's legs gave out and she sank back into her chair. "You're going to give it all away," she whispered. "Most of it, yes," I confirmed. Eleanor specified several charities that help elderly people maintain their independence and dignity. It seems fitting, doesn't it? I turned to address the room more broadly. But there will be one family trust established. Not for Michael, unfortunately, since he allowed his wife to treat me so poorly without intervention, but for my future grandchildren, if and when they exist, provided they're raised with values that Eleanor would have approved of. Michael's head snapped up. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, looking directly at Susan, "that any children you have together will have access to a substantial education fund and inheritance, but only if they're taught to treat people with respect regardless of their financial circumstances. The trustees will monitor this closely." Susan's breathing was becoming rapid and shallow. "You can't do this. You can't hold our future children hostage because of a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, my voice hardening. "Susan, you spent 6 months treating me like garbage because you thought I was poor. You planned to have me institutionalized. You called me pathetic and embarrassing. You turned my own son against me with your constant complaints about my lifestyle." I pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. "And just in case anyone thinks those recordings were somehow taken out of context, let me share what you said to me directly, just 3 weeks ago." I pressed play, and Susan's voice filled the room again. But this time it was a recording I'd made myself during that terrible conversation in my apartment. "You know, Janice, Michael and I have been talking. After we get back from our honeymoon, we think you should seriously consider selling this place and moving into one of those nice assisted living facilities. Nothing fancy, just somewhere more appropriate for your situation." The recording continued with Michael's voice agreeing, talking about peace of mind and safety concerns. I stopped the playback and looked at my son. "You were planning to have me committed to a nursing home," I said. "Not because I needed care, but because I was an embarrassment to your new lifestyle." Michael's face crumpled. "Mom, I thought we were helping. Susan said you seemed lonely, that you were struggling." "I was struggling," I agreed. Struggling to understand why my own son had stopped seeing me as a person worth respecting. Struggling to figure out when you'd started viewing me as a burden instead of your mother. The truth was settling over the room like a heavy blanket. Guests were beginning to gather their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing what had become a very public family implosion. Susan suddenly stood up, her desperation making her voice shrill. "This is insane. You're destroying our marriage over some stupid test. We can fix this, Janice. I can change. I can be better." "Can you?" I asked. "Because 15 minutes ago, you stood up at your own wedding reception and publicly humiliated me for being poor. Not because I'd done anything wrong, but because my financial situation embarrassed you." "I was drunk," Susan protested. "I made a mistake. You weren't drunk when you were in that bridal shop calling my apartment pathetic. You weren't drunk when you told your mother I was an embarrassment. You weren't drunk when you convinced my son that I needed to be put in a home for my own good." I folded the documents and put them back in my purse. "Those weren't mistakes, Susan. They were revelations. They showed me exactly who you are when you think there are no consequences." Susan turned to Michael desperately. "Tell her, Michael. Tell her we can work this out. Tell her you love me." Michael looked at his wife for a long moment, and I could see him really seeing her for the first time. Not the beautiful, poised woman he'd fallen in love with, but the cruel, calculating person she'd revealed herself to be. "I thought I did," he said quietly, "but I don't think I ever really knew you." The finality in his voice seemed to break something in Susan. She let out a sound that was half sob, half scream, and ran toward the exit, her wedding dress trailing behind her like a symbol of everything she'd just lost. Her bridesmaids looked at each other uncertainly, then hurried after her, leaving the reception in complete disarray. I turned to Michael, who was sitting alone at the head table surrounded by overturned champagne glasses and the ruins of their wedding cake. "I'm sorry it happened this way," I said, and I meant it. "But I'm not sorry you found out who she really was before it was too late to change course." Michael nodded slowly, tears running down his face. "I failed you, Mom. I let her turn me against you, and I was too weak to stop it." "Yes," I said simply. "You did fail me. But people can change, Michael, if they really want to." I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a business card. "This is my new attorney's information. When you're ready to talk about your future and whether Susan will be part of it, call him. There are some decisions you'll need to make about how you want to move forward." I handed him the card and started to walk away, then paused. "The trust fund for your future children is real, Michael. But it comes with conditions that will require you to become the man I raised you to be, not the man Susan tried to turn you into." As I walked toward the exit, I could hear the murmur of conversations resuming behind me. People would talk about this wedding for years to come, but not for the reason Susan had hoped. 6 months later, I sat in my favorite chair in my small apartment, watching the morning sun filter through the same clip-on lamps that Susan had mocked so cruelly. The apartment looked exactly the same: polyester furniture, garage sale finds, and all the modest comforts that had somehow become symbols of shame in my former daughter-in-law's eyes. But everything had changed. The papers scattered across my coffee table told the story of the past half year. Divorce documents, signed and finalized just 2 weeks ago, charitable donation receipts totaling $2.2 million, and a thick folder from Whitfield and Associates detailing the establishment of the Eleanor Hartwell Children's Trust, funded with the remaining $500,000 of my inheritance. Michael had called me 3 days after the wedding, his voice hoarse from what I assumed had been days of crying and soul-searching. "Mom," he'd said, "Susan's gone. She left that night and never came back. Her parents came to get her things." I hadn't been surprised. Susan was many things, but she wasn't stupid. She'd realized immediately that her marriage was over and her reputation in our social circle was destroyed. Running away was probably the smartest thing she could have done. "I'm filing for divorce," Michael had continued. "I know it's fast, but after what happened, I can't even look at myself in the mirror, knowing what I allowed her to do to you." The divorce had been swift and brutal. Susan had tried to claim half of everything, but the prenuptial agreement her own parents had insisted upon worked against her. When the recordings of her cruel comments about Michael's family became part of the court record, even her lawyer had advised her to settle quickly and quietly. She'd left town entirely. I'd heard through the gossip network that still connected our old social circle. Moved back to her parents' house in another state, claiming she needed time to heal from the trauma of having her privacy violated. The irony of Susan calling herself the victim in this situation wasn't lost on anyone who'd witnessed her performance at the wedding. Michael had moved back into his old apartment, the one he'd shared with Susan before they'd bought their house together. He'd called me once a week since the divorce was finalized, but our conversations were stilted and awkward. He knew he'd failed me, and I wasn't ready to pretend otherwise just to make him feel better. "I keep thinking about what you said," he'd told me during our last conversation. "About becoming the man you raised me to be instead of the man Susan tried to turn me into. I don't even know where to start." "Start with yourself," I'd suggested. "Figure out who you are when you're not trying to impress someone or live up to someone else's expectations." It was good advice, though I knew it would take him years to fully understand what I meant. A knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I wasn't expecting anyone, and for a moment, my heart skipped, wondering if it might be Susan, back to cause more trouble. But when I opened the door, I found a young woman I didn't recognize, holding a manila envelope. "Mrs. Hartwell? I'm Jennifer Martinez from the Riverside Community Center. I have something for you." I invited her in, curious about what could bring a stranger to my door on a Tuesday morning. "We received a very generous donation to our senior services program," Jennifer explained, settling onto my polyester couch without any of the disdain Susan had shown. "The donation came with specific instructions that we find the donor and thank her personally." She opened the envelope and pulled out a photograph that made my breath catch. It was a picture of me at the community center's Thanksgiving dinner for seniors last year, serving food to elderly residents who couldn't afford a traditional holiday meal. I remembered the day clearly. It had been just a few weeks before Michael's engagement, and I'd volunteered because I was dreading spending the holiday alone. "The person who sent us this photo said you volunteer here regularly, but never under your real name," Jennifer continued. "She said you always just sign in as Jay and refuse to let us put you on any recognition lists." I stared at the photograph, confused. "I don't understand. Who sent this?" Jennifer smiled. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. She said she was your aunt and that she'd been watching you volunteer here for years. She wanted us to know that her donation was inspired by seeing how you treated people with kindness and respect, regardless of their circumstances." My eyes filled with tears. Eleanor had been watching me, even before she'd written her will. She'd seen me serving meals to seniors who reminded me too much of my own uncertain future, and she'd understood something about my character that even my own family had missed. "She left specific instructions that the money be used to expand our meal delivery program," Jennifer continued. "She wanted to make sure that elderly people in our community could maintain their independence and dignity in their own homes, just like she'd observed you helping others do." I wiped my eyes, thinking about Eleanor's final gift. It wasn't just the money she'd left me. It was the knowledge that someone had seen my worth when I felt invisible to everyone else. "There's one more thing," Jennifer said, pulling out another document. "Mrs. Hartwell established a volunteer recognition fund in your honor. Every year, we'll recognize a volunteer who demonstrates exceptional kindness and compassion toward seniors. The first recipient gets a small cash award and a plaque, but more importantly, they get the satisfaction of knowing their kindness has been noticed and valued." She handed me a small plaque with my name engraved on brass. "You're the first recipient, of course. Mrs. Hartwell was very specific about that." After Jennifer left, I sat holding the plaque and looking around my small apartment with new eyes. Susan had seen poverty and embarrassment. Michael had seen obligation and burden. But Eleanor had seen something different entirely. A woman who chose kindness over status, who measured worth by character rather than bank account balances. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Michael. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice tentative. "I was wondering, would you like to have dinner this week? I've been seeing a therapist, working through some things, and I'd like to talk to you about what I've learned." I considered his request. The old me might have said yes immediately, eager to rebuild our relationship regardless of the cost to my own dignity. But Eleanor's test had taught me something valuable about setting boundaries. "What have you learned?" I asked. "That Susan didn't turn me into someone I wasn't," Michael said quietly. "She just revealed who I already was. Someone who valued appearances over substance. Someone who was embarrassed by anything that didn't fit my idea of success. That's on me, not her." It was a good start. "I've also learned that you've been taking care of people in our community for years, and I never even knew about it. Mrs. Patterson from the community center called me yesterday. She said you've been driving her to doctor's appointments for 3 years. Mrs. Patterson was 87 and had no family nearby. Driving her to appointments was such a small thing that I'd never thought to mention it to anyone. She told me about a lot of things you do that I never knew about, Michael continued. Grocery shopping for homebound seniors, visiting people in the hospital who don't have family, organizing meal trains for neighbors going through rough times. You've been living the values you tried to teach me, while I was busy judging you for not having enough money. I felt something ease in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for months. I'd like to have dinner, I said finally. But not because I'm ready to pretend nothing happened. Because I think you might finally be ready to understand what did happen. I am, Michael said. And Mom, I'm proud of you. Not because of Aunt Eleanor's money, but because of who you are when you think no one important is watching. After we hung up, I walked to my bedroom and opened the jewelry box where I kept my most precious possessions. Inside was a letter Eleanor had written to me, delivered by her attorney along with the inheritance documents. I'd read it dozens of times, but the words still moved me. Dear Janice, it began, if you're reading this, then my little test has run its course. I hope it taught you what it taught me. That the people who love you for who you are will love you regardless of your circumstances, and the people who don't aren't worthy of your energy. You have spent your life being kind when kindness wasn't easy, generous when you had little to give, and dignified when others tried to strip away your dignity. That is worth more than money, though I hope my money will help you continue being exactly who you are. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the jewelry box. Outside my window, the world continued spinning, full of people making the same choices Eleanor had tested, choosing between kindness and cruelty, between substance and appearance, between love and convenience. As for me, I was exactly where I belonged. In my modest apartment with my polyester furniture and my clip-on lamps, surrounded by evidence of a life well lived and love well given, rich in the ways that mattered most, and finally free from the need to prove my worth to anyone who couldn't see it for themselves. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.